Good morning. Welcome to another episode of the Liberty Dad podcast, a discussion on politics and culture. Tuning in live, I want to especially thank you for giving me your time so early. Talk about Israel and Hamas are just dominating the news, obviously. It's an unfortunate but appropriate time for libertarians to discuss their views on war. Now, most of us consider ourselves to be anti war. I won't be speaking for others, but I can definitely speak for myself and tell you why I am anti war. All right, so let's get started. I want to start out. This is a podcast, of course. So you always, it feels like podcasters that like their job is to, in some way, criticize someone or something. We don't just necessarily convey information, but we're opinionated blowhards. So let me start off with that. I'm not coming from a place today like you might hear from other libertarians. Other libertarians tend to come from a place of talking about principles, right? Like they will say, "Well, I'm anti-war because I'm principled," and that's fashionable, but it's pointless. When you are trying to convince someone else of a position, people are rarely, if ever, moved by how principled or consistent you are. The idea is to convey an idea in a way that is convincing to them to say, you should adopt this too. Nobody adopts an idea so they can be consistent like you, or so they can say, you know what? I'm principled like the person that told me they were principled. And that's why I hold this position. Like that's absurd. And I'm criticizing because I have seen a lot of libertarians. You see this all the time, but especially like lately, I've been seeing a lot of libertarians. They're like, "Oh, well, you're not a real libertarian." Talking, and this is very common in the libertarian community. We meaning the group of us, not necessarily me, will have this tendency to tell people that they're not a real libertarian because they don't hold a particular position that we believe they should. And I find that kind of silly because if you think about it, who are you talking to when you say that? And like, what is the point of it? I mean, think about it for a moment. Let's say someone were to ask me my opinion on some position on a topic, and I were to give it, and then they said, "Well, that's not a real libertarian position," and I might say, "Well, that's the position I hold. What position do you have?" And then they might say, "Well, I'm consistent. I'm not. I'm principled, unlike you. So therefore, I hold this position." Well, are they talking to convince me? Because it doesn't seem like that would be how you would go about it, right? And if they're not, then are they trying to convince maybe people that are standing or, observing? Maybe it's on social media, maybe it's in person, who are they talking to exactly? Who are they trying to convince? And what is it they're trying to convince the other person of? And so I've seen a lot of this, and it's kind of the reason why I said, well, maybe I should do a podcast because us podcasters are always looking for reasons to do a podcast. And I thought, well, maybe I should do a podcast and talk about why I'm anti-war and why other people should adopt this position as well. And so rather than saying you're not a libertarian or trying to tell somebody how principled I'm simply just going to discuss my thoughts on being anti war in general. Now, what I'm not going to do is I'm not really going to take any particular position on who is right or wrong in the Hamas or Israel conflict. Okay. And the reason for that is because I simply don't have the knowledge to say, this person is wholly in the right and this person is wholly in the wrong. And my opinion, generally speaking, on war is that there does come a point when it no longer matters. Like both sides are being, they're doing things that I disagree with. And this is the nature of conflict, right? Like if conflict goes on long enough, it becomes very muddy who is right and who is wrong. Right. And if you think about, I mean, think about it from a from a less complex situation. Think about a husband and a wife who are in conflict, and they've been in conflict for a very, very long time. And at a certain point, he's got his reasons, she's got his reasons. And if you're like the counselor or you're somebody that's listening to him, he might be saying, well, she does this. And then the wife is like, well, he does this. And then the husband goes, well, that's because you did this. And then the wife was like, well, that's because you did this. Right. And it's just this constant back and forth. And then after a while, you're like, oh my gosh, like like if I'm going to be objective, both of you are inflaming this situation, and it's not clear anymore who started it. So I kind of look at wars is that in that fashion, right? Like there are in particular in the Middle East where we've had issues, not we, but there have been issues in the Middle East for what, centuries? It's been a very long time. So at this point, there are for me sitting over here in the U.S., not being a well-read person on Middle Eastern affairs, and that would include how the people think, why maybe the people voted for the people that they voted for, what the leadership was thinking or doing, those kind of like more than just the actions that we see, but all the things that surround those actions. So I'm not really going to take a position there. I will say this just so it's clear. Anytime you initiate aggression, I think it's wrong. Even if even if you believe that, or if it was true, even if the other person or the other party um, had done something prior. So if my neighbor on Monday throws a rock through my window, and then in 2 weeks I throw a rock through his window, he is wrong and I am wrong. So I will take that position, just so it's clear. So let's move on. That was my criticism of my own peers, and hopefully they will watch this and they will go, you know what? Maybe I should stop doing that and maybe try to be a little bit more convincing to people. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of discuss, since I'm not going to talk about my principles. I'm not going to tell you about the non-aggression principle, which I think does play a role. And I think it is a foundation for my views, but it is not necessarily what I want to lead with, right? Like I'm not leading. It's not that you don't have principles. It's not that you don't have a particular philosophy that you adhere to. It's that you have to be mindful about, is this what I want to lead with? Is this going to be the thing that communicates an idea in such a way that the other person wants to adopt my position? Because at the end of the day, why bother? Why bother holding a position to the point that you're going to communicate it to others if you're not trying to convince them to adopt it? And if you're trying to convince people to adopt it, then that means you have to become the speaker they need to hear. So hopefully this is something along that line. So what does anti-war even mean? Well, I don't know that there's a formal definition. I didn't spend a lot of time looking it up. For me, I am not entirely opposed to the idea of war. Okay. I'm opposed to the initiation of war, and I'm opposed to war or actions in war that end up indiscriminately killing civilians. Okay. That's my big beef with war, is when civilians get caught up. And we'll talk more about those in a moment. So now it's true that casualties of war do happen, but I think that we need to be mindful about casualties of war and trying to reduce them. The expectation should be, we don't want to see casualties of war. We want to reduce them. And it really kind of should look at like, you know how like here in the US, people say, one gun death is one too many, right? And if we're talking about an innocent person, not a person that's aggressing against another person, I agree. One gun death is too many. I disagree with people who say that their solution. And I think the same thing can be applied to war. We should look at it and say one civilian casualty is one too many. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we stop all of our actions because one person might get killed, and I know that some of my peers may throw a big fit about that. What I'm saying is we use that to guide our actions and say, all right, should we do this? Is there another way? Like these are the kind of questions that we need to ask. And if you're watching people's conversations online, they're not really doing that at all. Like people are literally just like make the Gaza Strip a parking lot. Okay, well, there's a lot of civilians, a lot of civilians there, and that is indiscriminately killing civilians. If you just say, "Look, level it and make a parking lot," right? Like that is atrocious, in my opinion, and that is not the idea of saying, "Okay, we understand that sometimes there are casualties." That's not understanding that there's a casualty of war. That is intentionally murdering people. So I think that we should expect to see a better effort to not do it. Because to me, one of the, again, the killing of civilians is a big deal for me. Now, if two soldiers want to get into a fight, effectively go and fight and shoot each other, I mean, I guess, I guess they can. I don't like the idea. I don't like the idea of, maybe my tax money going toward that purpose. But I do understand that sometimes war between nations does happen. So um, I think this is a good time to kind of recall what I said yesterday when I was talking about the non-interventionism and isolationism. Now, I believe, strictly speaking, our our party, the National Party, is more of an isolationist party. The problem that I have with these words is that people don't seem to use them as they're properly defined. They add kind of meaning to them. So again, to kind of get into the meaning just really briefly, both of these terms oppose intervention in other countries' affairs. So, strictly speaking, you could say you're a non interventionist or an isolationist. And in some part, that will mean that you don't believe in country A intervening in country B's affairs or intervening if country B and country C are fighting. But non-interventionism, this is where the distinction is, does permit international commitments, where isolationism does not. And I tend because I think you're going to find the anarchist in the libertarian sphere are going to be more of the isolationist, whereas your standard libertarians are going to be closer to non-interventionism, but some of them may be isolationist as well. Now, I don't know that for sure. I haven't really done. I haven't really went out and kind of done a poll on this, but just based on what I understand of each views, because you're anarchist, they don't believe in government in its current form. It's not that they don't believe in rules, just not rulers. Okay, but again, if you've heard my podcast before, they can speak for themselves. I'm just kind of giving a very brief here overview of it. And then I look at it and I say there are libertarians, and then there are anarchists. So the libertarians, they tend to accept some level of government. Well, if you accept some level of government, however small it may be, then inevitably it's possible that you are going to accept some sort of international commitment. Some agreement between two countries because you've already accepted the government as an entity in itself. But that doesn't mean necessarily that a libertarian will. So if you're listening and you're like, oh my gosh, all these terms, all you need to know is that there are, broadly speaking, two types of people in the libertarian sphere. One is a little bit more aggressive in their opposition to government, where one is pretty aggressive, but not quite all the way as the anarchist. And then the non-interventionism versus isolationism, the distinction is simply whether or not the United States government can make commitments to other countries, like sign a treaty, whatever other commitments they might make. And so for me, I'm a little bit more sympathetic to it. I'm willing to hear it out, but like I like my government, tiny, tiny, tiny. I want our any kind of commitment to internationally to also be tiny, 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 the very limited. Because here's what happens when you have these kind of commitments. You are basically committing the people in your country to something, right? Um, If we say if the United States makes a commitment with Canada and we say, okay, we're going to make a treaty that we will never bomb you and you never bomb us, right? Let's just make it really super simple. Well, then that means that you know maybe that's not a good example. We're going to go with it. It's not going to be the best libertarian example, but we're going to go with it. So what that means is now that the U.S. government has said, all right, we can't attack you, but what if the American people feel for some reason, for some crazy reason? This is why I said it was a very libertarian analogy. What if the American people say, look, we need to attack Canada, right? Well, now they've obligated them not to. Better example might be, hey, we're going to obligate ourselves. Like if you have a terrible winter, we're going to give you food and supplies, right? Which sounds like a very nice thing to do, but you are committing that on behalf of the American people. Now, in that particular case, probably also not the best analogy. It is 7 in the morning, so cut me a little slack, folks. But the idea here is that we just kind of want to understand what this means. This means that we're committing, if a government makes an agreement internationally, they are in some way committing the people to that. Okay. So that's why you're going to have a lot of libertarians that are going to oppose that. Now, here's the cool part. Neither one of those exclude free trade. So free trade is something that whether you're a non-interventionist or whether you're an isolationist, you will more than likely agree to. Now, there might be people outside of the libertarian community who are like total isolationist. I don't I That's not the place that I'm coming from, nor is that the place that my peers are coming from. So I'm not really going to discuss it further because I'm Liberty Dad. We're talking about, from a more libertarian perspective. Now, let's move on and let's talk about history is good to know when we're talking about being an anti-war person. Okay. But it can be deceiving. And that is because people engage in a process called resulting. So let me play this clip and we're going to talk about what resulting actually is. It's a very interesting concept that I heard a number of years ago, and I want to share it with you now. So let's pull that up on the screen here. All right, add it to the stage and let's play this video. So this video is of Annie Duke, the poker player, and she is describing resulting, and then I'll kind of get into it a little bit more. So let's listen in.
What resulting is using the outcome quality as a perfect signal for deriving decision quality. So let me give you an example. It's 2015. People will remember the Super Bowl, the Seahawks against the Patriots. And the Seahawks are on the 1-yard line. There's 26 seconds left. It's second down, and they have one timeout. And I think that people will remember that, and they're down by 4, by the way. People will remember that famously, Pete Carroll called a pass play. Russell Wilson passed the ball. It was intercepted. And the next day, the headlines were, let's just say, pretty bad for Pete Carroll. So they were, worst play in Super Bowl history. Pete Carroll's, I think some of them called him an idiot. But headline after headline after headline after headline was about how completely ridiculous this call was. Now, there were a couple of outlying voices. One of the main ones was a guy named Benjamin Morris over at 538, and he went through some of the analytics on the play and actually had very, very good arguments for why that was, at worst, reasonably thought through and possibly quite a brilliant play if you were just thinking statistically. It's easy to see what's happening here, right? Because all you have to do is the thought experiment. And the thought experiment is this. Pete Carroll calls the pass. Russell Wilson throws it, and it's caught in the end zone for a touchdown. And just take a minute and think about what those headlines would have been the next day. Instead of worst play in Super Bowl history, they would have been Carroll outsmarts Belichick. It would have been about his creativity. This is the kind of thinking that got him to the Super Bowl in the first place. This is why he's the best coach in the NFL and deserves that ring. Now, obviously, whether the ball is caught or dropped does not actually change whether the decision was a good one, but we act like it does. And that's what resulting is.
All right. So that's a bit of an old video, and I actually heard about this years ago when Annie Duke was on a podcast. She was on the Bigger Pockets podcast. It's a real estate podcast, and she was talking about this, and she gave that same example for anybody out there that's not a football person like myself. That maybe that may not have been the best way to describe it, but when I listened to her, she used that example. She also used an example from her own life, and she basically said that she evaluates all of her plays after a poker game. And one day she kind of came to this realization that she was evaluating her plays, and she would make she would play her hand in such a way, in some way, and then later basically determine whether or not that was a good play based on the result that that she received. And so I think that, and if you want to think about this in maybe yet even a different example, think about you want to buy a home that you want to renovate and sell, and you go through and you do all the things that are appropriate for buying a home. You have your inspection and all these good things, and you determine, yep, I have a good idea of what the renovation cost is going to be. I have an understanding of what the market is right now. I've checked out the prices in the area. I believe that buying this home, renovating, for such and such amount of money, renovating it for such and such amount of money will allow me to sell it for this much money and allow me to bring in a certain amount of profit, right? So maybe you're like, all right, I'm gonna, after it's all said and done, I'm expecting to get, $30,000 in profit. Well, then maybe during the renovation process, you uncover some damage that neither you or the seller realized, right? So it's not like the seller had hidden information from you, but you find that there are some things that do need to be resolved, and it's going to cost you more money. And let's say that it reduces that $40,000 payout now by half. So now you only make $20,000, right? And you might be like, well, I only do these kind of projects if I'm going to make $30,000 or more, right? Like I'm not interested in it because, and it may sound weird to some people, but the reason that someone may put that number on there is to guard themselves for when things do happen, to ensure that they always are making a good profit. And then there's some other reasons, but so imagine that now it goes from a $40,000 profit to 20,000. It's cutting right in half, right? So you might look at it later and say, well, that was a bad decision. But the question is not whether the decision was bad, right? Was the decision good or bad based on the information that you had available at the time? And so if you were to say, well, it was a bad decision because I lost half the profit that I anticipated on getting, that is resulting. But it also goes the other way around as well. And it resulting is also when you determine that a decision was good based on the result. So this is where a lot of people say, well, I tried it and nothing bad happened. So they determined that the decision was good because nothing bad happened. Like I jumped off the roof, I didn't die. So therefore, it was a good decision. But that's not an appropriate way to determine decisions and whether or not in particular action should or should not have been taken. You have to evaluate the information that you used to make the decision. So how does this tie into, say, war? Well, I think a lot of people when they're looking at war, because we're talking about like being knowledgeable about history, they look at things and they do a lot of resulting. So let's talk about briefly the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, most people who support the bombing, they do so for two reasons. One, Japan attacked us, and number two, the bombings delivered the results that we wanted. And I've heard a lot of people say that. They will say, "Well, Japan's never attacked us again, have they? So it must have worked." And this is resulting. This is determining that an action was good based on the result that you got. And it's actually a terrible way to analyze decisions. What people don't do necessarily is evaluate what information was used to make a decision. So we're not going to rehash the Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, I personally, I believe that it was wrong, that it was morally a moral failure of the United States. Okay, and again, remember at the very beginning, I started talking about civilian deaths. So let's look at some numbers here. We're gonna talk about some numbers. Actually, I'm not gonna pull any on the screen. So Everybody knows we bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki because they bombed Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor bombing resulted in 68 civilian casualties of the 2,403. And the Hiroshima, in comparison, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings resulted in over 100,000 civilian casualties, but a much smaller number of soldiers. Okay, so there was a very disproportionate number of civilian casualties. Now, an argument that a lot of people like to make is they say, well, the citizens supported that. Well, maybe not so much. Okay, nations have the right to self defense. It's not that the US didn't have the right to defend themselves from the Pearl Harbor attack. The catch is that governments often do things that their citizens wouldn't approve of. And sometimes they lie to get that approval. So consider the case of Afghanistan. Now we're going to set aside the Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We're going to come right back to that. But consider the case of Afghanistan. The American people were told that for like 20 years that the US was winning the war on terror. However, it turns out that wasn't true. And the US spent some billions of dollars and they lost 2000 over 2,400 soldiers lost their lives, along with about 1,800 civilian contractors who were working for us. And then another 20,000 people were injured. That's more lives lost than Pearl Harbor for a war that our own government lied about. We didn't even win. Now, I haven't even added up the lives, the innocent civilian lives in Afghanistan. That would obviously increase the numbers as well. So, to bring that back now to the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we might say something like, well, their citizens supported that. So, therefore, they're just as guilty. And to some degree, that is true. But if that is true for another country, then that's true for us. So we have to decide, are we as citizens willing to be as culpable for the US government lying to us about the war in Afghanistan, causing all manner of death with our own people, injuring over 20,000, costing billions, and then killing the lives of the innocent people over in Afghanistan, those who died, right? Are we willing to be just as culpable for that as we are justifying, like, say, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? And the actual truth is most people aren't. And that's a problem, right? We need to, like, we cannot say that we value life if we keep changing the rules under which we will value it. We cannot talk about, oh, well, our people were bombed and they were wrong to do this. And look, 68 2,403 people were killed by this attack, and they were wrong. And even their citizens play a role in that, but then turn around and say, well, the US is different. Like, that's not how it works. Right. And this is the kind of thing that will actually get people angry. This, I don't believe that other countries generally hate us for our freedom. They may not like some of our freedoms. They may not like the fact that we got like strip clubs and all kind of crazy things going on. They may not like it, but remember, we're just as far away from them as they are from us. So it's pretty easy to kind of detach yourself and say, you know what? I don't like what's going on over in that country, but whatever. That's what they do what they do, right? And so I don't believe this. I don't buy into this notion that we are being attacked because of our freedoms. I believe that we're being attacked because our government is doing things that we might not always agree with. Now, we might, and I say we just generally as Americans, not anyone in particular. Um, but that's the catch, and that's the kind of thinking that we need to have. This is why I believe that we start with this notion of if we look at it in the context of one civilian death is one too many. And I get it. Sometimes it does happen. But the aim, the North Star, if you will, should be zero civilian deaths if a conflict, a war conflict is absolutely necessary. Now, how does ownership, self ownership, play a role? Because I think that, in past episodes, what I've talked about is that we should have this, this simple foundation that we should be able to explain to anybody. And for me, I say I rest my libertarian hat, if you will, on three pillars. And those three pillars are starting with self ownership, the non aggression principle, and freedom of association. And we don't have to necessarily use those terms specifically. We just need to describe what it means, because I think that's far more valuable. Now, I look at it and I say that self ownership is the core, the foundation for everything. And then what happens is we should understand self ownership. We should understand all of them, but we should understand self ownership well enough that we can apply it to virtually anything. And I made this analogy a while back in one of my other episodes where I said, and when I was about 15, I was taking martial arts, and our instructor told us, he said, "Look, if you know the basics," his name is Sifu Ming. He is like now a grandmaster, like he's legit dude. Okay. So like it wasn't that weirdo from what was that movie? From Napoleon Dynamite. It wasn't that crazy dude with the American flag dressed out talking about, fighting. No, this was a legit dude. And he said, "Look, if you know the basics and you know them well, you can defeat an opponent who is doing all kind of fancy moves." So I think it's very important that we spend time just focusing on the core, the very foundations of our views, and then learn how to explain them, whether we use the words or not. I tend to use them because I know some of my audience is libertarian, and I want to make sure that I'm connecting these terms to the ideas. But sometimes I will talk to people and I will explain it. I almost always use the word self ownership because it's a pretty simple word and people tend to get it pretty easily, and it's not a lot of confusion. The non-aggression principle and freedom of association, those tend to be a little bit a little bit more challenging words because they're like the terminology that an in-group can sometimes use. But anyway, self-ownership, how does it play a role? Well, look at the war in Ukraine. um, I do believe, now let's put this on the table so that nobody is like, "Oh, you Russian sympathizer." Russia was an aggressor. And like I said earlier, if you initiate aggression, you're wrong. If you initiate the attack, you're wrong. Earlier in this episode, I said, if my neighbor throws a rock through my window on Monday and 2 weeks later I decide to get back at him by throwing a rock, I'm wrong and he is wrong, right? Like self defense isn't a later date. Like that's not how it works. Self defense is while there's an active threat. So if one country has done something and and then the action is delayed, while I get it strategically, I look at it and I say that is a violation. Okay. Now let's get back to Ukraine. A little digression there. Um, I believe that you own yourself, and that means you direct what happens to your body. Well, in Ukraine, men that are in between the ages of 18 and 60 are not, and I believe this is still in place, are not permitted to leave the country. So there's a moratorium that prevents them from leaving the country because they might need the soldiers. Ukraine also has conscription. So the U.S. we technically have like conscription in the background because all men have to sign they have to sign up for selective service. It's like this weird thing where you have to sign it saying that you agree to it, but you have to sign it. So it's like this weird kind of like forced consent. And then also in Ukraine, they have increased penalties for deserters. That one I'm a little on the fence of because if you make a commitment to an organization, and then when that organization needs you, like when they need that commitment, then I kind of take a little bit of issue with it. But on the other hand, you should always be able to revoke your consent. So it's a little tricky on that one. I'm a little bit on the fence with that. But the fact is, Ukraine does not permit men 18 years old to 60 to leave the country. They have conscription, so men are required to do some level of military service, and they have increased the penalties for deserters. And the with the exception of conscription, the other two actually were initiated at the outset of the current war that they're having. So a lot of people say, well, Ukraine has the right to defend themselves. They do. But remember, Ukraine, as with any country, is basically two parts. You have your government and you have your people. And as I pointed out in the Afghanistan situation, that the government had certain knowledge that the people here in the United States did not have. and they directly lied about it. So they told the American people, hey, we're winning the war on terror and this is going to make you safer, blah, 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 blah. Of course, Americans should have been more diligent. Story for another day. So when you require people to be in the military service, when you prevent them from leaving if they would otherwise choose, when you increase the penalties for desertion, that does not that is not the definition of people defending their homeland. That is the definition of a government protecting a plot of land, whether or not the people agree or not. And I don't know whether or not the people agree, but what I do know is that there are these limitations. And the problem is that we often focus on the aggressor and disregard what the other side has done. And if we look back historically, because we were talking about it historically a moment ago, if we look back, we find that in many wars, probably most, if not all of them, both sides have done things that are morally improper, that we should have some moral disgust over. It is rarely the case where one country attacks another country, the other country attacks and does their best to not kill any civilians, and so on and so forth. And I want to point out that we tend, like, while we focus on the aggressor, we often focus on their actions, even if those actions are similar to the person that's being attacked. And we need to be mindful. So again, this is why I go back and I say one civilian death is one too many. We should aim for the fewest amount of civilian deaths. So if by chance Canada were to attack us, which I know they wouldn't, but if they were, um, even if they attacked a lot of our civilians, I would morally be opposed to just indiscriminately throwing a bomb over to Canada, because it's not a guarantee that their people are fully informed what their government is up to. In the same way that the American people were not fully informed what their government was up to in Afghanistan and Iraq and many, many other wars as well. So this is to me is how we hold a consistent position. And the reason, the value of a consistent position is not so that we can parade around and talk about how principled we are. That's worthless. Like talking about it is. Being it is not worthless, but talking about it is basically simply bragging. That's it. It's not really convincing anybody else. But if we are consistent, then we will hold our own side accountable, and then we can insist that other people hold their side equally accountable. Now, in Russia and Hamas, they are both definitely aggressors in the current wars, right? Like they initiated this, so no disagreement there. I'm only suggesting that what we do is whatever we apply to the aggressor, we apply to the other person, and whatever we're not willing to accept, we need to make sure we don't ask somebody else to accept, because this is how we bring a more peaceful world, because people are not stupid. They can see when you are being inconsistent, and it's not a lack of principles, the ability to say that you're principled. That's not what makes people angry. It's basically do as I say, not as I do. And we don't like it in everyday interactions. If somebody yells at me, like let's say I'm at work and a coworker yells at me and I get mad and whatever. And then later on, I yell at them because I'm mad about something else. And then they go and they say, hey, he yelled at me. And they tell my boss and I get in trouble. Well, I'm going to be upset, not because they were, not so much that they told on me, but partially, but because like part of the reason I'm going to be, one of the main reasons that I'm going to be upset is because this person engaged in the very same action I did. So it was okay for them, but not okay for me. Well, if it's not okay for another country, if we're going to hold other countries' citizens accountable for what their government does, whether they have the knowledge or not, whether their governments are being forthright or not, we need to do the same thing. Because when we don't, the people will see that and they will start siding with those people. Now, another reason to consider civilians is because I believe that the death of civilians very much increases future conflict. And we've got a long history. I'm not even going to go into any of the history, but we're just going to break it down very, very simple. And I saw this the other day. A friend of mine, Dave Smith, somebody made a comment, and they said, Dave Smith is a Jewish man, and somebody made the comment like, "Hey, if Hamas," they basically said, "Hey, if Hamas had killed your family, you would be willing to take up arms against them." And he said, "You're right. I probably would. I also would if I was a Palestinian. How do you think I would feel if I was Palestinian and the same thing happened?" Right? And so he recognizes that when civilians are killed, it invokes a certain visceral anger because and I'm trying to, I don't like to make threats. So I'm trying to couch my words. So I'm not making a threat. But if somebody were to harm my family, I would want to viciously respond, period. Many men would. And I'm probably going to set aside whatever principles I have. Now, it's not a guarantee, but there's a strong possibility that whatever principles that I have, I want vengeance. The reason that we want to hold this idea of one civilian death is too many is because the more civilians we kill, or not we, but the more civilians that are killed in a conflict means the more family and friends who are not killed that might be willing to take up arms at a later time. And they may come back with a vengeance. That's what happens in many, many conflicts. That's what, from my understanding of the Middle East conflict, that has been this back and forth, kind of like a volley, if you will. One side kills some civilians, and then the other side says, "You know what? You killed our civilians, so now we're going to go do this thing." And so this is constant back and forth. So I think for me, the anti-war position for me is to oppose the initiation of war and oppose explicitly the indiscriminate killing of civilians, because civilians they're not always on board with what their government is doing. They and that means that they are definitely, if they are not familiar, if your government has lied to you and told you one thing, and then you believe them, foolish or not, um, then there is a distinction between that and knowing what the truth is and making a decision and giving them the go ahead. There is a distinct difference, and we need to make sure not to forget that. So again, Russia, Hamas, definitely aggressors, but that doesn't mean that actions don't have repercussions later on. And while soldiers may be willing to go and fight other soldiers, which again is something that's kind of a weird thing to say, citizens rarely get that choice. They end up just getting caught in the middle, and that is problematic. Again, you own yourself. You may choose to fight in a war or not. Maybe it's because you want to defend the homeland. Maybe you don't. Maybe you question, is it worth it? I'll just move to another country. I don't really like this place anyway. Maybe you believe that your government is complicit in some actions, and so that the aggressing army is doing so because your government has done something that you wouldn't have agreed with anyway. So why would you want to fight and defend them? Maybe you just want to live as long as possible with your family. The reasons are endless, but the reasons are yours to choose from. The US has a voluntary military. We do have the selective service, but our military is comprised of people that want to be there. We are detached from the realities of conscription. We are also too trusting of our own government and what they tell us, and what they tell us. I believe, I'm going to see what time we got here. 7:53. We're good. So I believe that my position is also consistent with the libertarian platform as well, or at least mostly. Let's take a look at it. Let's pull it up on the screen here real quick, because people like, let's share this. There we go. And add to the stage. Bam. Let's put it up there. Let's make it a little bit bigger. I think we can make it just a wee bit bigger so that, how's that? Yeah, that looks good. Okay, so under Section 3, securing liberty, here's what it says: in the United States, constitutional limits on government were intended to prevent the infringement of individual rights. So again, self-ownership by those in power. Okay, again, we know that government, people in power, aren't always so forthright. The only proper use of government, should it exist, is the protection of individual rights. The principle of non-initiation of force, that's, you can't be the aggressor, should guide relationships between governments, which I agree. National defense. So 3.1, we support the maintenance of a sufficient military to defend the United States against aggression. The United States should both avoid entangling alliances and abandon its attempts to act as policemen for the world. We oppose any form of compulsory national service. So already, any country that has conscription is, for the libertarian, is in violation of our platform, and we take our platform very seriously. This means something to us. We don't always agree with everything in the platform, but we largely do. You might find a few libertarians who agree with every single word of it, but probably you're going to find libertarians who mostly agree with it and have small differences here and there. Heresy abounds. What can I say? Um, but as long as another country has conscription, well, they're in conflict with us. And that's because you own yourself. You have the right to dictate whether or not you want to go to war or not. As silly as it may sound, if I were a single man living at home and somebody broke into my home, it is my choice whether or not to fight back. I can just flee if I wanted to. I could technically do it if it's my family, but I think that you have an obligation. So I would consider that a moral failing. That is a topic for another day. Um, so in here it says the United States should both avoid entangling alliances and abandon its attempts to act as policemen for the world. So it says avoid entangling alliances. So, in my opinion, if you are a non interventionist, which I talked about earlier, which says we do not get involved in other countries' affairs, but we might make commitments, international commitments. That's what non interventionism is. Isolationism is where you do not make any commitments. My reading of this says we should avoid it, but it doesn't explicitly say that they are not permitted. So I believe that a non-interventionist position is acceptable within the platform. It doesn't violate it. That doesn't mean that it's the best position to hold. Maybe an isolationist position is the better position. That's up for each individual to decide. So that is my show for today. It was an awful lot. It's 7 a.m. in the morning, and here I am breaking it down. I hope you enjoy it, folks. Let's see. Let's take a Keith. He jumped in with Morn. Good morning to you, sir. Good morning. Thank you for watching. And thank you for anybody else that is watching, whether you're watching live or whether you're watching at a later time. I'll take either. Remember, catch me every morning, Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. Eastern, for an informed discussion on politics and culture. And then again on Sundays, 7 p.m., where I bring on my co-host, Susan Hogarth. We discuss the LP happenings. What are LP happenings? Well, that's what the state and local affiliates are up to. We go out and we search all across the U.S. and we see who's doing what. And we're not going to bring you simple things like, hey, they're having a business meeting. Those are expected. But if they're having a meeting where you can meet a local candidate, well, yes, we're going to try to talk about that. Be sure to do all the proper audience actions. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. Where is that little graphic? It is right here. All right, subscribe to my YouTube channel. I also am up on Rumble. I promise, I know I keep promising and saying I'm going to get to it, but life is so busy right now. So I will eventually be getting the episodes to Rumble as well. I made that decision a while back. You can check. You can check. I think I can't remember which episode it was, but I will be hopefully maybe in the future moving more exclusively to Rumble and less on YouTube. I don't know. We'll see. But eventually, here within the next week or two, you should start seeing more and more episodes pop up on Rumble. And then eventually, I will start streaming to Rumble as well. If you are wanting to follow me on social media, you can do so. Liberty Dad, all one word, on Facebook, Liberty Dad Pod, on X, formerly known as Twitter. Email me, libertydadpodcast@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. Remember, if you are a champion of liberty, your business is people and your product is liberty. Have a great week. Catch you next time.